All right.
She's on the downside. But,
All right.
Are we starting?
We can. Are you ready?
I've got some markers here. And I just, you don't have an easel.
No, but we
but
can
you do have. I'm just gonna maybe, I wonder if this could go like this.
Aha.
Darn. Oh, I don't want to break it. This is not actually.
Okay. I wonder.
But actually, you know what? I can.
If you need a volunteer to hold it. Yeah, I can.
This is a lot easier. I'm just gonna do that.
All right.
way to problem solve. There you go.
That's what
All right. Well, here is. Then I will introduce you.
Okay.
This is Dr. Matthew Knoester.
Knoester. You got it right. That's the first time. Wow.
Yay. Well, you told me before. So, and you're coming from Ripon College, but he lives close. So, oh, and this is Maggie.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
I'm Matthew.
Matthew and Maggie.
Nice to meet you.
You're Ricky, Michael. All right. So go ahead and take me back.
Okay. So I have to be honest with you that this lesson, which I call Everyday Inequalities, is really geared for undergraduates. And you all are not undergraduates. So it's really probably not going to be, it's not going to go the same way, you know, that it typically would in a class that I was teaching with undergraduates. But I still think it's a fun exercise. And it's something that I think hopefully will provoke some good conversations. And so what we're going to talk about today and what we're going to inquire into is how various social forces of inequalities present themselves, how they function, how they're perpetuated, and how we might begin to notice them more in our everyday lives, in our day-to-day life. And further, how we might recognize, you know, as teachers, if we're going to be pre-service teachers, or if we're currently teachers, if we're working with students, how we might be able to interrupt some of the reproduction of social inequalities that we know happen in day-to-day lives, but especially also in schools, because that's what we're focusing on, right? So the first thing I'd like to do is to brainstorm, as this question up here already suggests. What do you think are the main kind of dispositions or attitudes or the attributes that you'd really like to encourage with students? So pretend like you are a teacher, an undergraduate pre-service teacher, or an actual working teacher in, you know, sort of a typical elementary school. So you're thinking about young children. What kind of attitudes or dispositions do you think we should be encouraging or fostering among our young children? I just want to brainstorm a list. Yeah.
I would say experimentation or comfort with failure.
Okay. That pen is not so good. Oh, this marker. Sorry. I'm going to try this one. Experimentation and, did you say comfort?
Comfort with failure.
Comfort with failure, okay.
I like critical thinking.
Okay.
I think about flexibility.
What do you mean by flexibility?
I mean flexibility in terms of how they think. So kind of it goes along with open-mindedness.
Yeah.
Okay.
And to build on that, I would add creating opportunities for them to see things from multiple perspectives, which would encourage flexibility.
Okay, okay. So ability to see multiple perspectives, okay. See other people's viewpoints, the points of view.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Kindness. I find it to me, in high school, they're not quite as interesting as they have been.
Is that an attribute?
Kindness?
Oh, you were
Yes.
you were talking about kindness. Okay. Yep. Yeah. How about confidence? want students to be confident?
Respectful.
Mm-hmm.
Curious.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
this
Donna?
list,
This list.
this list is,
Yeah.
it is about attitudes and dispositions.
Yes.
Nothing is about content.
Not really about content. No. No. Not really. But what kind of dispositions do you think might facilitate content?
Well, some of those.
Right. So.
So
are you thinking- yeah.
as a secondary person and a middle school person,
Right.
I was wondering if this is would this be where you would focus your?
It would be one of the focuses.
Yeah, you would focus this before you focused on content, or you would intertwine them.
Yeah, maybe the chicken or the egg. You know,
Yeah,
what
but isn't
comes first?
experimentation and curiosity and inquiry, aren't those like the foundational forms of investigation of any discipline? Like to be able to see others' perspectives is to be able to understand you have your own space that you're coming from. I don't know. I just
Right.
I would,
Yeah.
but I would argue, and
Yeah.
I would argue
We're very
that people
precocious
in
undergrads.
the secondary fields would
Yeah.
We're in the
Yeah.
AP class.
Yeah.
I would argue though that people in secondary fields would not be looking at these attitudes or dispositions about first. They would
Okay,
be
first.
looking at their content
Yeah.
first, and that's what I think is kind of
Yeah.
interesting about this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if it's a saying here, but when I was a doctoral student at Madison, very typically, like one of the cliche phrases were knowledge, skills, and disposition.
Right.
You know, so you're always looking for knowledge, skills, and disposition. What are the knowledge, skills, and dispositions? You know, that were. So this is focusing on one of those,
Sure.
right? Not all of them. But maybe the disposition does help facilitate the knowledge and the skills as well. It's not that there should be only one and not the other.
Although I would argue again that secondary folks would stop at knowledge.
I think that's a problem. Yeah. Is there anything else that you might think about? And of course, you know, how do you build confidence unless you have a record of academic success, for example, or a record of public successes that students, you know, you want to build these kinds of dispositions over time. And hopefully even in adulthood, like this might be actually important for the rest of our lives, not just for learning, right?
I can think of one more if you don't.
Yeah.
I think of advocacy for self
Okay.
and others.
Okay. Is that a sort of, it's more than empathy.
Yes, yeah, it's
Uh-huh.
definitely more than
Because
empathy.
it's-
But empathy, I think, is important as well, but I think empathy goes with that, especially if you're advocating for others, right? So I
Yes,
think,
add empathy
But
as well.
empathy it stops, right? There's no action involved in
Right.
empathy.
Right.
so maybe advocacy could be an action
stepping out.
Right, I
Coming
mean, you
out
can
beyond.
show empathy, but it's
Right.
not gonna help anybody.
Right, and empathy plus commitment plus a strategy kind of might be more towards advocacy. Yeah. Okay, I think this is a pretty good list for now. So, all right. So the next thing I'd like to do is, and the point of this, like I said before, is to try to begin to notice or pay more attention. Not that you don't, but I think especially for pre-service teachers, to try to notice how these kinds of how social forces of inequality might inhibit things like this. Okay, so I have several different pieces of paper here that have, you know, kind of forces of inequality, different kinds of inequality. So I have race and racism, gender and sexism. I have ability/disability. Look, there's one that's called lookism, and basically a lot of people ask, what does that mean? It basically means people, the quote unquote social standards of beauty. So for example, if you look at a magazine, like a fashion magazine, you know, they have like particular people who qualify as models and other people who don't, right? So there's these standard, so there's discrimination around that in our classes and society. So that one's called localism. And then there's class and classism, and there's language, and there's religion. And so I'm going to put these, I'm going to tear these off, and I'm going to put these around the room. And I hope that you all will help me brainstorm what are the particular, what are the ways that the actions, the interactions, or the systemic inequalities that you've either witnessed or that you know about that you think might perpetuate these various forms of inequality? So are there little interactions or comments or cliches or common sense beliefs or media portrayals or media language that you think might be our everyday, day-to-day ways to notice these inequalities taking place? Okay, are there any questions about that? Okay, so I'm going to, all right. I'm going to hand that to you, and maybe you can just put it on maybe, yeah, I don't know if it's easier to write. Yeah, I don't know if it's easier to write on a wall or on a table.
That's probably easier to write on the boards here.
Okay. And then if everybody could also take a marker. Julie, would you mind moving that marker?
I like how eager these undergrads are to assist you.
Oh, I know.
And then there's the 2 ones in detention.
Knoester brings chocolate a lot.
Oh, well. Wah, wah. Okay, so everybody please get up and walk around and contribute to this group brainstorm.
And so how are things portrayed that perpetuate?
Yes.
So
Yes, like phrases, things that you've heard, experiences that you've had, interactions that you've had, systemic.
so would housing be enough to explain?
I mean, the more specific, maybe the better.
So if I were to put white trash here, would that work for
White trash in
classism?
quotes.
In quotes, yes, that's
Yes.
something that's said.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. That'd be great. I think you deserve a better marker than that. I'm sorry, that one's a little bit.
Oh,
That's
okay.
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Tanya, you don't have a laser pointer, do you?
No, not here.
That's okay. Yeah. Sometimes during the discussion, it's fun to kind of like point to things with the laser.
There's a- Are we not supposed to?
I've done this before.
Oh, good.
That's hard.
have this down here, the red one?
Oh, Maggie does.
That would be, yes, yep.
Yeah, and listens to other things too.
Yeah.
On his computer.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, I know, like, what else do they call it? Chord? I don't hear that one anymore, no? Mm-mm.
GH. TH. You got it, GH.
Hey. You know, I did too. I would have called.
EIGNE.
All right, maybe how many more minutes do we need? Maybe 3 more minutes? Yeah, it looks like there's a lot of ideas.
I saw the red thing. I know. Oh, so I've had more beef in the last month.
Uh-huh.
Can I speak to your hands?
Yeah. Great.
All right, last comments. I don't think we could do this all day. What's my spaces over here? Okay. Oh, this is remarkable.
Yeah, that was over
Okay.
there. I helped myself.
Yeah.
I made use of the resources.
There. Okay.
Social class privilege.
Mm.
You know, it's what we're doing in having class, right?
Yes.
This is where she's comfortable. Where it's ownership. Okay, so well, first I should ask you when did this exercise feel like before we get to the question of what you notice in the actual substance.
I found myself always thinking about the way I wanted to say it. I knew what I wanted to say and write down, but I wanted, like, before I wrote it, I wanted to know if it would be how it was going to be perceived by others.
I found it kind of jarring when you that said white trash. I was like, whoa,
Yeah.
like, we're going right there.
Oh.
Like, do you know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
so it was just because these are
Yeah.
some of the things that are taboo. You just don't
Yeah.
talk about. Sometimes you don't say. So
This is gonna get real quick.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
I do something similar in my
Yeah.
classes, but we don't make it public.
Oh, interesting.
What we do first is at tables, like I'll do a pair share,
Okay.
and then everyone will compare their pair share at the table, and then we'll go and
Yeah.
put the stuff up publicly.
Okay. Okay.
And what I found is that if I don't start
Yeah.
with white trash
Mm.
or something that is completely inappropriate, they won't go there.
Oh, interesting. Uh-huh.
Especially in a public forum.
Yeah.
I also sometimes give them something to read that brings out, a literary text that would bring out some of these concepts to
Yeah.
lighten the,
Yeah.
oh my God.
So let me ask you, this way, the way that we did it, how did it feel to you?
Well, for me, it's fun.
Okay.
I'm not, I
Yeah.
don't think it should be fun.
Oh, it's fun.
But-
Okay.
but it
I thought you
is-
said fun. Okay.
No,
fun.
it's fun.
Okay, fun.
Yeah, I find it
Okay.
a fun thing because
Yeah.
if we can't, if we can't confront
Yeah.
our biases or what we know
Yeah.
to be inappropriate,
Yeah.
then I think that the students are never going to be able to face
Yeah,
it
yeah.
themselves. A lot of my scholarship deals with how do you get students, pre-service teachers,
Yeah. Yeah.
to engage in
Right.
language that is going to be inappropriate. But if you don't engage it,
It's
how
used.
are you going to deal with
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I felt a lot safer in here than I think my students would feel,
Mm.
writing something like Make America Great Again, because I think I think at the university, and I don't mean to overly assume it, but I do somewhat assume that people have similar political views in the sense that our students,
Yeah.
that is not the case.
Yeah.
Good point.
Well, I
And,
have to say,
so even after the election in 2016, and
Right.
then even after certain things we always had to think about, and now that higher ed is under attack in these different ways. I had a colleague who was, her slides on whiteness were put up on Fox News. Like a student took pictures of them and then posted them in an alt-right forum,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
so I felt like,
Yeah.
I felt safe, but I
Yeah.
wondered if my students would feel
Yeah.
safe. Granted, I know
Yeah.
that there would be a culture that
Yeah.
we can.
I've done this with undergraduates a lot of times, and students always come up with things. They don't come up with nearly as many things as you all did, or nearly as quickly, but there are always things that people came up with. And I don't think people jump to white trash necessarily, although I don't think that would surprise me if somebody did that with an undergraduate class. But some of the things that I do find is that students oftentimes gravitate toward particular forms of inequality and not others. So for example, race. Race is probably one of the biggest, kind of stigmatized discourse that we have in our society. And so I think people are more reticent to add to that one. But once you say lookism, they're like, oh my gosh, I have tons of things about lookism, or I have tons of things about, so everybody is able to find something in one of these, if not all of them.
But up until recently, wouldn't you agree that gender and sexism was not something recognized quite as easily by millennials and the generation ahead, Generation X?
Yeah. Well, the other thing about this exercise is that it's not about consensus.
Right.
So you can write something and somebody else can disagree with it, and we're not going to try to agree necessarily. It's a brainstorm in the original meaning of that term, which is just like we're coming up with ideas. And I think that people learn just from other people's ideas. Just, I learned something about society, or maybe I learned about you personally by having that up there, even though nobody's committed to agreeing to it. So people always come up with ideas about sexism, but I don't necessarily think that means everybody agrees.
Right. Well, I can honestly, a man can't be a feminist, which we forgot to put up there.
Right.
But going back to what Candan said, is that some of the comments being put up by some of our students could really be believed.
That's true.
It's not just
I've heard this.
right.
Yeah.
It's not
Right.
just I've heard this, but I really believe this.
Right. So then in a facilitator's role, I think it's important to, interrogate that. But that doesn't mean that we're all going to vote and decide that it's going to be correct. But I think that it's okay for the facilitator to have an opinion about what's appropriate and what needs to be challenged or what needs to be expanded upon and elaborated. The teacher does teach, even though it's a brainstorm. And so I think it feels like it's open, even though there is teaching going on.
I think too, when sometimes you put things, students put things up like this, and so Christy and I were just saying the ghetto, right? I think now, like when students see that up there, like they may check themselves, like, oh, I do say, oh, this is
I
ghetto.
had to drive through the hood to get the UWM there.
Right. So
Right.
it may be a way for
Yeah.
them also to check themselves internally and say, oh,
Right.
perhaps that's not the best thing to
We
say.
Right.
talked about too, the way they're using it now, that
Right.
we heard students
As a-
saying,
As an
their
adjective.
their phone is old, like, man, this phone's so ghetto.
Yeah.
Like we hear
Yeah.
that a
Yeah.
lot.
Even in the typical,
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's even a little bit counter-hegemonic or common sense just to say there are inequalities, right? Because a lot of people even go day by day and just think, oh, everything is meritocracy, everything is the way it should be. And
Is that Trump?
Right.
That's totally
Right.
their Bible.
So this is forcing students in a way to say there are inequalities. And if you don't believe that there are, you need to counteract every one of these comments. Because these are all just examples of things that most people are familiar with. Most people have heard short bus or the little bus or, disability or most people have heard, these are everyday things all around us. And to be framed as forces of inequality, I think is important.
And just like students become more comfortable writing those things after they see other people writing those things. That's what we
Yeah.
did.
Right.
And I think it was critical that you participated. I always participate with my students because you can't hang in the backdrop.
Yeah,
Right,
you can't
right.
be adding
Oh,
that
no.
gaze,
Yeah.
further
Right.
gaze where they're already like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
where they can't even see their own disposition because
Right.
there's so much fear.
I mean, if
Right,
I could
right.
be more inappropriate than my students, then they're gonna dig a little
They
deeper.
will. They
Yeah.
will.
I felt myself, even when you would start writing, going, oh, what is he writing?
Oh.
Like,
Yeah.
It's probably going to be good.
Yeah.
I can't believe
Yeah.
you wrote that as well.
Yeah, right. White trash. White trash music. And then the second critical part is then to go back to, okay, now you're a teacher. Now you're in an authority position. Now you have children that might fit into one of these categories. How are you going to build these dispositions if the students are hearing things like this every day of their lives or throughout their lives? You know, somebody who lives in a trailer park, you know, they're going to be called white trash. Somebody, you know, is a girl and so she can't become a scientist or she can't become a mathematician. I don't think anybody wrote that, but you know, those are kind of typical understandings about gender and sexism, right? So what does that do to these dispositions?
I think they all kind of fall, those critical thinking, they all seem to fall on the continuum in terms of like fear and comfort, or like, I mean, disposition. I mean, I'm just thinking like experimentation and comfort with failure. You're not going to have that. You're not going to have curiosity if you don't feel safe. And you're not going to be able to build confidence if you don't feel safe that the fact that you do take a bus in here from the ghetto or from a trailer park.
Yeah.
That's going to make, you're going to be on guard. I mean, feeling safe is such an incremental part of learning. And I think we don't necessarily focus on that as much in our teaching because they themselves, our teachers preparing to teach students, they themselves don't feel safe even.
Yeah. So the next critical piece is, if this is what we're aiming for, and this is what's happening around our students, what is our role as teachers to interrupt these narratives, to build this? What can we do as teachers? So that's the next real question.
I think for me, and I'm an assistant professor in exceptional education.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of children that have disabilities, right?
Yeah.
And so it makes me think that, particularly in the general education classroom, that teachers need to be able to have students feel success. And I think that success then can foster a lot of these things. Once they feel success and confidence, that they can then become more comfort with failure, have more comfort with failure, because these kids experience failure regularly and that's what they expect. And so you as an educator have an obligation to the children, I think, to the students, to make them feel successful. And not to make them feel successful, but for them to be able to demonstrate their success.
To create those opportunities and the scaffolding and everything that it takes for them to make the steps that you know they're capable of doing, and then to actually have a repetition of that public success over and over. Yeah. Other things, what are things that teachers can do to counteract some of these sort of negative?
Bring it to the student's attention. So
The children's attention, the young children.
yeah, call it out what it is. You can't get, if you're gonna dance around it, you're never going to address it. There was one instructor that started every day, it was either a high school or middle school teacher, taking a photograph of the leading story in the news without the headline.
Interesting.
And asking the students, what do you think is happening? What do you think is the headline behind this news story? And one that was just unbelievable was there was a bunch of homeless people in front of the White House. And in the picture, you couldn't make it out that they were people all huddled together. And the responses, there's probably 27 different responses that came just from looking at the picture with no background knowledge of the story.
Yeah. And what did they come up?
They came up with, they thought they were mounds of snow. It was just, the responses were all over the place and nobody had hit the actual headline. But it was the way that particular teacher started every day.
Which like generated this comfort with taking risks.
Yes.
And like, okay, nobody knows the headline here.
Yeah.
And it also makes visible the background knowledge that they're bringing.
Yep.
It also sounds like kind of critical media literacy, like looking at the media critically, realizing that sometimes media is sending really harmful messages to our children. And we have to counteract those because they're hearing them. We can't pretend like everything's neutral and everything that we provide is something the first thing that they ever.
And if advocacy's on the board, you have to do more than talk about it. So, what action are you going to take with your students to take it off the conversation into an action?
But I also think we have to teach the pre-service teachers how to respond to these when they happen in their classes.
Yeah.
when they see inequity. They can't objectify the student. I mean, if the student says something inappropriate,
Right.
How are they gonna handle that student? I mean, is it a public admonishment? Is it a private? How do you engage that? And I do think that our students need that, even role playing that. How do you support and teach one student not to be inappropriate, but also support that other student not to maybe advocate for themselves and respond to hurtful comments.
Because you care
or
about both of
bullying.
them.
Right.
You care about both of those students.
Well,
Right,
role
but-
playing addresses the multiple perspectives.
Right,
It's a great
and-
way of
right.
looking at it.
But, I've often seen in secondary schools where someone says something inappropriate, makes some kind of, some kind of racial slur, and the teacher lets it go.
Yeah.
And so, because they let it go, not because they agree, they let it go because they don't know how to handle it.
Right. Teachers can't be neutral. We have to take a stand for values and for justice and for equality and for, everybody being, worthy of love and respect and caring. Right? So does that mean somehow defending somebody who's being bullied or somebody who's being kind of victimized, right? But also doing it in a way that doesn't necessarily disparage the person who's being the bully, but kind of ropes them in. It's a tricky balancing act. And how do you do it? So then you look at race and you say, okay, well, a lot of the Black boys are sent to the office, right? So if somebody bullies, does that mean sudden suspension? Does that mean sudden, harsh consequence? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a Black boy. It could be any child, right? So thinking about, how do you have more restorative justice within your classroom, where you mediate, where you work with kids' feelings and everybody's identities, right? That's what I would think. But
I think you make a very powerful point about how teachers are not neutral.
Yeah.
And I do feel that many of our teachers come and they hide behind their content. Oh, I'm not going into teaching because I'm
right.
Everything's political. But I think that's such a big part, their political coming, their activization of their civic self has not happened yet. I think oftentimes, and so I think that is very difficult.
Yeah.
But it's very necessary, I think, but as an educator, as a teacher educator, I just say it's very difficult
right.
But I think it's so necessary, and so it's something that I think I'm being more explicit about in whatever I'm doing. I'm teaching you about text complexity because this is a tool to give you power for when you go into your school and they hand you a curriculum. I want you to be actively able to say, hey, this curriculum is crap. Maybe not your, but be able to.
Yeah.
But I feel and I constantly say that this is a political profession, whether you're choosing it or not. Even if you say you're not political, you are. But it's difficult, and I would love to with my colleagues here. And I'm acting now not as a.
That's a great point.
But I'd love to talk about more about that. How do we create them, and how might that lead to actual more resilience when you're actually in the space?
In English Ed, we actually put it in our syllabus that in the methods courses that teachers are advocates and that teaching is a political act.
Yeah. And then how do you do that?
Yeah.
In the actual day to
Right.
day.
Well, we had a long discussion. Our first lesson in our first methods class is, what are you going to teach? And why that? And what political statements are you making? Because you decided to teach Huckleberry Finn or To Kill a Mockingbird as opposed to something by The Hate You Give, or The Hate You Give, or or work by Kwame Alexander, or whose vision of racism are we looking for?
And it's interesting because I have a lot of her students for her program before they even take their first methods course, and they have no political sense. There's a few that are like, I'm going into education this way, but you have a lot of people that are like, I know Shakespeare. and this is why I'm going into English Ed, and like,
Yeah.
don't want to deal with like issues of like linguistic diversity,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's like, so it's, I would love to be able to,
Yeah.
you know, be with them then later
Right.
during when they've gone through maybe more of that political awakening,
Yeah.
or that like figuring out that
Yeah.
disposition of like advocacy.
Yeah. And students have to know that being political isn't just being partisan, you know, so
Yeah.
you've got this
Mhm.
Make America Great Again, that might set, you know, some kids off.
Yes.
But that's not really what this is about. This is about the daily inequalities that all of us face in one way or another, you know, and the dispositions that we're trying, but sometimes this feels like pushing up a rock up a mountain, right? Even though it sounds so easy and sounds so simple, it's actually, we're counteracting the social narrative every day, you know, while we're doing that. And so we have to be made aware of that, but and give each other confidence about that and tools about how to do that. And that is political. And so I think a lot of students, you know, they're maybe afraid to talk about politics because it is treacherous terrain.
Well, we've also been colonized to not talk about politics.
Right.
Because, you know, here we are, teachers are intellectuals, but they're not allowed to think of themselves as intellectuals.
Right.
We are, you know, colonized females who look at their own students, and we don't call them our students, we call them our kids.
Mm.
So we've, you know, so we don't have that professional relationship, even with the people that we teach.
Right. Yeah. Other ideas about teaching interventions that might support this work?
So you mean as a teacher educator, teaching interventions?
Well, something that you might tell a pre-service teacher, or in professional development with teachers in MPS or another school, whatever.
I think universal design for learning is
Mm.
an essential, not really method, but manner in which you can instruct. And I think that meets a lot of kids' needs, and it builds confidence, and it allows students to perform their understanding and knowledge in ways that often are not deemed acceptable.
I agree with you on the use of universal design in our lessons. I also think that it's really important for us to tell our students, our pre-service teachers, why we're doing what we're doing. All my handouts are in Arial, because universal design says everyone can read Arial much better than any other font. And that's pretty revelatory for my students when they get into my methods classes.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
You know, we read aloud because we don't think you're not reading. We read aloud because you retain when you read orally and you follow along. Retention is better, but we don't necessarily tell them,
You have to unpack that.
right?
I always say we're the only profession where we have a true apprenticeship of observation. I said, you've been observing your profession since you've been 3.
Right.
Brain surgeons don't sit in surgery rooms at the age of 3, right?
Yeah.
You've been watching teaching your entire life. Not that you know what it's all about, but you've seen it.
Right. But weren't you the one, Angel, who brought up perspectives? Because that's really the work that these pre-service teachers are doing, right? Because they were the student, and now they have to take on the perspective of the teacher, and that jump is so difficult. I think if it's not going to be this kind of more really kind of a stereotypic view of teachers, but a much more critical thinker, because as students, we don't see all the decision making that the teachers are going through.
And as teachers, we also have our blind spots because we're doing it and not ever thinking of unpacking it because it's our blind spot. We're doing it all the time.
Took me forever to go, you're such an idiot. Tell them why you're doing
Yes.
this.
Yeah.
But not too much.
No, tell them everything.
I think it also goes a lot with identity work too. When we talk about shifting our perspective from student to teacher,
Right.
that's a huge identity shift too for
True.
our undergrads
True.
or postbacks or
Yeah.
whatever.
And this is identity work too,
Right now.
right? We want them not just to be like critical thinking sometimes, like just today, all the time, right? We want them to be always open-minded and flexible and thinking about open to new ideas, which goes along with curiosity. right? And confident, not overconfident, but confident enough to be able, public speaking is an important thing that you have to practice, and you have to, take that on as sort of like an identity, even though there's fear that goes along with it, and, being respectful, not just sometimes, right?
And you also can't
Yeah.
change your personal history. I mean, I always say, you sat at a dinner table, you heard things. You can't deny things you heard at your table. But if you're gonna be a teacher, you've got to critically examine them. So I can't be embarrassed of things I heard at my dinner table that I did not say.
Or you never sat at dinner table.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Exactly.
Right. So I don't know if you're familiar with the book Everyday Anti-Racism. It's edited by Mika Pollock, who wrote the book Color Mute.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, she edited the volume, and so there's all these really great chapters in that book. And so I just want to tell you about some of the interventions, the teaching interventions that I learned from that book. Maybe with some editorial comment. But she says, or these authors say things like, one of the things is to teach that race, and of course these are mostly focused on race, is an obsolete biological concept, and that people oftentimes don't realize that actually there is no biological foundation to race, although they used to think that, right? It is socially constructed, and there's real inequalities that are based on that social construction. But biologically, there is no difference. And so, I think that's part of the courageous conversations that we need to have, with children. And that everybody is beautiful. Even though there's this lookism idea, the standard of beauty, it's oftentimes racialized and, these kinds of things. But we have to always be teaching against that, against this one standard of beauty. Courageous conversations about race, critically thinking about care, follow children's leads in conversations about race, right? I think that's sometimes a really difficult thing, is that these are really abstract concepts for a lot of students. I think what's powerful about this is that it comes out of their language, if we're doing a group brainstorm. And so following up on how it comes out organically from students, I think is a teaching opportunity. As opposed to like abstract philosophy, we're going to read this book, and the students their eyes are going to glaze over because it's not their language or their experience, And so just, the pedagogy, I think, aspect of it. Observe complex ways students interact informally. So this is another thing that I think is really the heart of it, which is it's about relationships, and it's about getting to know students and getting to know what their motivations are and what their cultural assumptions are. And that's the way that you create, sort of safety and the trust and the care that is so necessary for students to then take risks. So for example, if a student in your class bullies another student, like in the example that we were talking about earlier, and then you as the teacher take the advocacy position of the student who was bullied, the way that you don't disparage the bully is by having an underlying relationship of care and trust that person knows that you really do care about them, even though you're admonishing them, right? Kind of like parenthood, right? Kind of like parenthood, where sometimes you admonish your children and they know that you love them. But students don't always know that. And if they don't think you care about them, why should they listen to anything you say? Like if they think that you're really undermining their goals in life, why should they listen to you? It's rational to resist that, to resist a teacher who doesn't care about you, right? So I always felt like it's important to persuade your children, your students, that you care about them. And if you ask them, do you think I care about you? And they say, no, you don't. That's a serious problem, right? Create cocoons for strengthening identities is something that they suggest. Students of color may need to heal from internalized oppression. Urge students to see and treat one another as equally worthy. That one. Refuse to see individuals as representatives of achievement gaps. Mindset of curiosity about your students as individuals, that kind of goes back to that. individualized points of personal connections with your students, high standards, assert your belief in students' ability to reach your high standards.
Can you go back to the cocoon one?
Yeah. That one was create cocoons for strengthening identities. So I think that would be kind of along this race and racism one where it says, the lack of role models among teaching staff, those in authority that look like me, right? And so sometimes males need a male role model, you know, or sometimes you need to put people together who share a particular identity, but they're in the minority and they don't feel like they're welcome here. So I think that's what that cocoon refers to.
I think we can create cocoons too with the assignments we have in our classroom, where our teachers, their lives become the text. Their lives become the knowledge that it goes under analysis and development. So like an assignment that we create could have them looking at their own life, their own racialized learning, and analyzing that, and then for them to develop their identity within that. So I think even if there aren't people around that look like them, there can be spaces that are sanctioned as like, this is a space for you to figure out the own politics of your literacy development.
And you can,
So our
you can create
science can do that
relationships
too.
across boundaries, across identities as well.
Oh yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I don't need to create a siloism, but yet
Right,
sometimes I think before people can move across, they need to become
It's a
aware.
comfort, yep.
They need to become aware of like, what are some of those identities that have informed who they are and how they're being perceived, whether they realize it or not.
Other ones are assert your, think carefully about groups, honor non-standard knowledge, do not disparage the non-standard varieties of English students speak. So we haven't talked very much about language, but
And the use of the word standard to describe language.
yeah, definitely. What's grammatical? What's standard English? What is?
Well, and who owns that language, right? So for example, my husband, English is his third language. And so there's ways that he uses English that, you know, we've, as English is my first language, I've been taught is absolutely incorrect. But if you went to Tanzania, this is exactly how they teach it. And so I think, well, why am I saying I'm right and he's wrong? So who owns that language? Does anyone own that language? And what makes it correct or standard?
Right, the
Right,
power
so
that's
interesting.
associated
When
with
we
it.
lived in when we lived in Ireland, my husband would write memos and we would make them formal academic English, and he would turn them into his boss, and they would rewrite the memo.
This isn't the Queen's English.
This is not,
They would
right, this was
rewrite
not the
it.
use of language the way we use it, and they totally, and
so
we would
what-
look at things.
Yeah. What were they looking at? What was their quote unquote standard?
Well, there's their use of formal academic English differed from, I mean, they chose different words. They would sometimes reorder the syntax.
Sort of
would
a
be different.
British spelling.
Well, I mean, that was minor, the spelling differences. But yeah, some of the things we would go, well, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah, so another one of these suggestions is help students become fluent in multiple cultural codes. Because that's real power, to be able to, you know, comfortably sort of move in different academic or social spaces, knowing the cultural codes or the language codes of different locations. It certainly expands your horizons.
And we do that because if Candiace's kids are bilingual, and we think that they're really smart because they're bilingual.
Of course they are.
But I came from a second language household, and my mother was thought of as an idiot because she had two languages and she couldn't speak English when she went to school. So a totally different class structure.
Right. Yeah, and my father, some of you, I told already, my father came not knowing any English to the United States. And he was born in the Netherlands, and his first language was Dutch. And they came right after World War II, and you know, the economy was desolated. And you know, but he didn't try to learn Dutch. Like, he completely doesn't know Dutch, even though that was his first language, right? Because he was embarrassed about it, and because he tried to shed his entire identity as a Dutch-born person to the United States.
Interesting. My mother always forgets that she's a second language learner, that she spoke only Yiddish until she was 5 years old.
Yeah. And my grandmother, up until she died, she was my father's mother, every letter she wrote or every comment, she always apologized for it. At the end of every letter or every note or conversation, I'm so sorry, my English is so terrible.
Yeah,
know?
right. My mother is so afraid that people are going to recognize her Bronx accent.
Yeah.
That because that would be a class distinguisher
Yeah.
and a language distinguisher.
Yeah. But what Fratney does with their dual language immersion, I think the goal is, fluency in multiple languages. And that's very different than just English as a second language, or even bilingualism in bilingual programs, right? Total literacy in 2 languages, and the celebration of cultures is really important. So, and then challenge cultural messages of who can and cannot do science and math, and this kind of thing. So anyway, okay, we can end it right there.
Okay.
Thank you all. Unless, do we have like a minute?
Yeah.
I'm looking at the schedule because it looks like I don't have anything.
Yeah,
until
that's- I was
11, but
looking
Well,
probably
actually,
all could
you're
teach.
going to Mike Steele, so.
Oh, okay. But I wonder if we might quickly go around and just say, what might be an action step that all of us are going to do out of this conversation, if any? What might you pay more attention to going forward, or what's something that you feel like, you know what, I'm going to make a change?
I think just being more deliberate about creating spaces through your assignments, et cetera, for your students to feel safe in your classroom. Just be more deliberate about it. And maybe that means pushing the content to the side a little bit.
Right.
I have to learn to be more tolerant of intolerance. And that is something I have been working on for many, many years. I guest spoke in a class on Thursday night on young adult literature. And I made some kind of flippant remark about Holocaust literature. If it wasn't for Holocaust literature, there wouldn't be a living Jew in any book in young adult literature. And one of the students turned around to me and said, "Oh, well, that's the same as drama in New York City on Broadway. Every play on Broadway is about being a Jew." And I was like,
Wow. Take a breath.
Yeah.
How can you say that? Yeah.
And so so I need to be, because I still, I'm not, I was more conciliatory than I normally would be, but I still think I need to work on it.
That might be the disposition of curiosity, which is like, how can you really think?
Well, I guess. And that's what makes me think I was being conciliatory.
I'm thinking a lot about giving my students more of a platform to look in further depth on their own identity. I think I want to do something similar to this, and I don't even feel my students are quite ready for that yet. I think they need to look at their identity first a bit before we dive. I don't know. So I'm thinking about.
This is part of the process.
Yeah, some of my students, though, they don't even think they have identity
Right.
as white people.
Right.
No, they
That's
don't
what-
notice any of these things or put them all together as social forces of inequality. They don't know that that's such a thing.
Right.
Right.
I'm thinking, I'm going to totally steal your idea, but what I'm thinking is important about this is my students get hung up on race and then they don't move beyond that. So then you leave disability on the table, you leave, I think race and class typically rise to the top of what they want to talk about. And I think if you frame this early in the semester, it gets away from that, always talking about race, always talking about, even though those are very important things, it doesn't cover all the
But
aspects.
research does show that that's what pre-service teachers focus on when you use the word diversity.
They do.
They do.
Well, I was thinking it's really the conversation. I need to be better at
building places for them to talk, I think, about this. I think, I put it in kind of journaling and things that are kind of private. But I think I need to have more opportunity in the classroom to mix it in with everything else.
You did really motivate me to take an action step already. I'm thinking about how I'm gonna change my class for Monday.
Nice.
Thank you.
Good.
I'm thinking of something that Donna said and really making things more explicit in the reasons that I do it. I teach a class on collaborations with families. And so we do a lot of this sort of work in that class, but I don't do a lot of explaining why we're interrogating things, and I think that that's something I need to do more.
I feel like I need to think a lot more, maybe similar to what Donna says about intolerance and the intolerance among us, but not necessarily in not an angry way, but just an impatient. I think I have too little patience for intolerance, and I think it's so prevalent, and all of us have different kinds of intolerances and different blinders to some form of oppression or some kind of experience that somebody's going through that is hard, and what we can do to maybe lighten the load on everybody, right? But I think in order to do that, we have to better understand the blinders that people have on them. And I think, so like sitting down and like really talking to somebody who has a different point of view politically than myself, and having more patience with that and trying to get to what that's about. And so one of the people I've been reading, who I think does a pretty good job with it, is George Lakoff. And he wrote this book called The Metaphors We Live By. And it's like, he believes that 98% of our thinking is unconscious, right? And so like it's about kind of bringing some of that unconscious, the metaphors, the frames that we have, and putting them more into the consciousness so that we can critically examine them. I think that's teaching as well, but I need more patience with that.
Yeah, I've been working on that for
Well, thank you for this opportunity to have this professional dialogue too.
Yes, thank you. Good thing there are no students here.